Hi everyone, this is Ashraf Hassanpour from Shiraz University of Medical Sciences Anatomical Department. In today's lecture, we are going to be covering the structure of white matter. First, let's look at the anatomical divisions of the white matter. There are three areas identified in each of the two halves, meaning each part comes in a bilateral pair. Between the anteromedian fissure and the anterior horn of the gray matter, or anterolateral sulcus, we find the anterior funiculus. The area between the anterolateral and posterolateral sulci is defined as the lateral funiculus, and finally, the area between the posterolateral sulcus, or the posterior gray horn, and the posteromedian septum is referred to as the posterior funiculus. Pretty straightforward so far, right? White matter on each side of the cord can also be referred as tracts, which have common functions. Actually, tracts are groups or bundles of axons that travel together within the CNS. So tracts are minated axons that have a common origin, a common destination, and a similar function. Individual tracts are either sensory or ascending tracts, which conduct nerve signals from the spinal cord to the brain, or motor or descending tracts, which conduct nerve signals from the brain to the spinal cord. This image shows sensory tracts in blue shading and motor tracts in the red shading on one side of the spinal cord. However, keep in mind that the spinal cord is symmetric. Both sensory tracts and motor tracts are on both sides of the cord. The naming of these tracts is also pretty straightforward. Let's take, for example, the anterior or ventral corticospinal tract. The first part of the name refers to the funiculus it's found in. The next part shows its origin, in here indicating an origin in the cerebral cortex, and finally we have its destination. Though the corticospinal tract extends from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. An important concept that we need to understand before we move any further is upper and lower motor neurons. Upper neurons will be those whose cell bodies reside in the brain, while their axon stretches to deliver information to the spinal cord. Lower neurons are those with their cell bodies in the gray matter of the spinal cord, which extends their axons to deliver motor information to skeletal muscles. Alright, so I think we got all the basic done. Let's move on to the descending tracts of the spinal cord. The good news is that we'll start with the tracts that we've already met. So let's cue the corticospinal tract. As this is a descending tract, we already know it will carry motor innervation. In this case, it's voluntary movement specifically. Now let's look at its pathway. The upper neurons in this tract originate in the motor centers of the cerebral cortex and descend through the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata of the brainstem. This part of the pathway is also sometimes referred to as the corticobulbar tract. Well, this is where things get interesting. In the lower portion of the medulla, around 80% of fibers cross over to the other side. That's right, our bodies are very strange in that the left hemisphere actually mostly controls the right side of the body and vice versa. This crossover is called the great pyramidal decussation. We say fibers which cross over to the other side decussate. The fibers will then travel downwards in the lateral funiculus of the white matter of the spinal cord, forming the lateral corticospinal tract. You can see the location of the tract in relation to other tracts in this image of the transverse section of the spinal cord, seen here. The tract has a somatotropic arrangement, meaning that in the spinal cord, its fibers are arranged in an organized fashion. The fibers from upper parts of the body are more medial, and the fibers from the lower parts of the body are more lateral. Let's now go back to the lower medulla and see what happens to the small amount of the fibers which do not decussate. You can see in the image that they travel caudally in the anterior funiculus to form the anterior corticospinal tract. Here we can see it in relation to the other tracts. It's a little bit different from its lateral brother in its function, as it only synapses with the gray matter in the cervical and superior thoracic regions to only supply those regions. It joins the gray matter of the opposite side by crossing over through the anterior wide commissure. It controls axial and girdle muscles of the opposite side. Okay, now let's meet this little guy, the rubrospinal tract. It has a much simpler pathway compared to the corticospinal tract we just looked at. It arises in the red nucleus on the upper portion of the midbrain. The term rubro is derived from its Latin name nucleus ruber, which, as you may have rightly already guessed, means red nucleus. It then crosses over at the level of the red nucleus at the ventral tegmental decussation through the pons and medulla oblongata and descends caudally in the lateral fasciculus of the wide matter of the spinal cord. The axons making up the tract terminate as they synapse with the neurons in the anterior horn of the gray matter. It's said to facilitate the activity of flexor and inhibit the activity of extensor muscles, but in humans it's underdeveloped. Another cute little pathway is the tectospinal tract. It gets its name because it originates from the superior colliculus, which is in the tectum of the midbrain. It decussates at the upper part of the tegmentum of the brain and makes its way down through the pons and medulla to end up at the anterior fasciculus, close to anterior median fissure. Most fibers terminate in the upper cervical region of the spinal cord and are believed to play a role in reflex posture movements in response to visual stimuli. The next one is reticulospinal tract. So these guys again are a little different to the tracts we've encountered. They don't strictly share their origin or any portion of the pathway, but ultimately have the same function. The tracts start in different locations of the reticular formation, which is a collection of groups of nerve cells and fibers scattered in the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. The medial reticulospinal tract arises in the medial part of the reticular formation, mainly in the pons, and descends in the anterior funiculus close to the anterior median fissure. It is often referred to as the pointing reticulospinal tract. Its main function is to adjust the posture by facilitating extensor muscles of the trunk and inhibiting some neck muscles. The lateral reticulospinal tract starts in the lateral section of the reticular formation of the medulla oblongata and is sometimes called the medullary reticulospinal tract. It travels in the lateral funiculus to synapse with the anterior horn of the gray matter. It facilitates the action of the flexor muscles in the limbs and the trunk. It may also carry some ascending fibers related to the pain transmission. This next tractor system, the vestibulospinal tract, is actually split into two, the medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts. They arise from the medial and lateral vestibular nuclei respectively in the medulla oblongata at the floor of the fourth ventricle. These nuclei receive information from the inner ear via the vestibular nerve and some innervation from the cerebellum. The inner ear sends information on the position of the body, so it makes sense that the tract related to it would send motor information to the muscles that are responsible for balance. Imagine if there was a problem with the inner ear. It would be misfiring signals about the position of the body, and the related muscles would be doing pretty strange things. The feeling of dizziness that often comes with people swaying, leaning, and sometimes falling over is called vertigo. The medial vestibulospinal tract naturally arises from the medial nucleus and travels down in the anterior funiculus. Interestingly, some of its fibers are crossed and some are uncrossed. Ultimately, this tract inhibits the action of the neck and the upper back muscles related to maintaining balance. The lateral vestibulospinal tract descends from the lateral vestibular nucleus ipsilaterally. What does that mean? Well, that just means it travels on the same side and doesn't cross over the other side of the body. It acts to stimulate the extensors and inhibit the flexor muscles in the neck, the back, and the limbs that are related to balance. Alright, so we've covered the descending tracts. Let's now jump into the wide world of the ascending tracts of the white matter of the spinal cord. Okay, so before we jump into the individual tracts, I just want to quickly run you through the tracts that you would find in the sensory pathway. So normally they are separated into first, second, and third order neurons. The cell bodies of the first order neurons huddle together in the dorsal nerve root ganglia. In these pseudo-unipolar neurons, the peripheral process stretches to receptors to collect sensory information and form peripheral nerves. Through the dorsal nerve roots, their central processes enter the gray matter and synapse with the cell bodies residing in the nuclei in the posterior horn. These cells in the gray matter are the second order neurons in the ascending fiber pathway. When the cerebral cortex is involved in the pathway, the fibers first reach the thalamus, and this is where the third order neuron resides. They then convey the information to appropriate area of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so now that we understand the usual order of the sensory pathway, let's start by having a look at the exception of the rule. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus are two rebel tracts occupying the posterior funiculus of the white matter. What's so special about them? Well, instead of the synapting with the second order neurons in the gray matter, the first order neurons extend their central processes from the dorsal root ganglia cranially, and so the tracts are formed by first order rather than the second order fibers. There is quite a logical arrangement to fibers in these tracts. The most medial fibers arise from the lowest ganglia, while the most lateral fibers arise from the highest ganglia. Fasciculus gracilis lies medially and contains fibers from the coccygeal, sacral, and lower thoracic regions, which means that it stretches the length of the spinal cord, while fasciculus cuneatus lies laterally and consists of fibers from upper thoracic and cervical spinal ganglia, which means it would only be visible in the cross section through these regions. These tracts extend cranially to the lower part of the medulla. The fasciculus gracilis then terminate in the nucleus gracilis, while the fasciculus cuneatus terminates in the nucleus cuneatus. The first order neurons' nerve cross the midline, so they are considered to be ipsilateral. From here, second order neurons cross over in the medulla and travel to the posterior thalamus. Third order neurons finally deliver the information to the somatosensory cortex. They carry information on proprioception, fine touch, vibration, and two-point discrimination. Alright guys, now let's get back to the tracts that actually obey the rules. Well, mostly. The anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract cell bodies of the first order neurons are situated in the spinal ganglia and extend their central processes to synapse with neurons in the gray matter. The only out of the ordinary thing is that they can travel for a short distance in the dorsolateral tract near the tip of the posterior horn before they enter the gray matter. They then make connections with neurons in lamina 2 through 5, mostly in substantia gelatinosa of Rolando and nucleus prepureus. These fibers then cross to the opposite side through the wide commissure to form anterior and lateral spinothalamic tracts. The main difference here is that the fibers making up the lateral spinothalamic tract will cross on the same level, while the anterior tract may ascend a vertebral level or a few before they cross over. A small amount of the fibers remains uncrossed. While the tracts are considered separate and even travel in different funiculi, they actually form one continuous band. The fibers of anterior tract carry information on crowd touch and pressure, while the lateral tract is considered with sensation of pain and temperature. Despite different fibers having different functions, they make up one functional unit. And, as the name suggests, the second order fibers of the tract travel up to the thalamus, where they synapse with the third order neurons, which carry the information to the cortex. The spinocerebellar tracts carry proprioceptive impulses from muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and other receptors to the cerebellum, which helps the brain to coordinate muscle movement. These tracts can be subdivided into anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. We will start with the posterior spinocerebellar tract, also known as the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. This tract carries unconscious proprioceptive information from the lower limb and the lower part of the trunk. The peripheral processes of the first order neurons carry information from these areas to the cell bodies located in the spinal ganglia at the spinal levels below C8. Their central processes extend into the gray matter. Here, they synapse with the cell bodies of second order neurons in the posterior thoracic nucleus, which is also commonly known as the nucleus dorsalis or Clark's nucleus. The posterior thoracic nucleus only extends between the spinal level C8 and L3. So, central processes of the first order neurons below the level of L3 hitch a ride in the gracile funiculus to reach L3, where they can synapse with the second order neurons in the posterior thoracic nucleus. The axons of second order neurons ascend in the posterior spinocerebellar tract located in the lateral funiculus on the same side of the body to the level of the medulla. Here the fibers enter the paravermal region of the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, moving on to the anterior cerebellar tract, which is also known as the ventral spinocerebellar tract. As its name suggests, it is located anterior to the posterior spinocerebellar tract and carries unconscious proprioceptive fibers from the lower limb to the cerebellum. First order neuron cell bodies are located in the spinal ganglia at lumbosacral levels L2 to S5, with their central processes synapting with the second order neurons in the zone between the anterior and posterior horns of gray matter, or lamina 5, 6, and 7. The second order neurons also communicate with the descending motor fibers distant from the lower limb. Most of their axons cross over and ascend in the anterior spinocerebellar tract proper, which is located in the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. At the supraspinal level, it passes through the medulla, pons, and midbrain. Here, the fibers enter the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncle. As if this pathway wasn't strange enough, the second order neurons then cross back to the site they originated from. So, the information from one side of the body is received by the ipsilateral part of the cerebellum. This is known as a double decussation of fibers. Both the posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts we just discussed have a counterpart, which carries information from the upper part of the trunk and the upper limb. Well, the conocerebellar tract is the equivalent of the posterior cerebellar tract. Its first order neurons originate in the upper limb and torso and into the spinal cord in the spinal region C1 to C8. While their cell bodies are still found in the spinal ganglia, the central processes of these first order neurons do not synapse in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Instead, they ascend in the cuneate fasciculus on the same side of the body and synapse with the second order neurons located in the accessory cuneated nucleus. From here, the axons of second order neurons enter the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay guys, we are done with the all difficult stuff. Well done. Now we know what's in the white matter of the spinal cord. Let's see how that changes the appearance of the white matter along the length of the spinal cord. If you look at the image, you'll notice white matter gets progressively bigger as it travels more cranially. And if you think about it, more and more fibers get added to the ascending tracts as we move up. And in the cervical region, you would have the fibers carrying information for a pretty much of the whole body. Similarly, the descending pathway have the most fibers higher up on the spinal cord because moving caudally, the fibers split off to supply structures at different vertebral levels. Okay, that brings us to the end of this lecture. But before we wrap up for the day, there is just one more thing I want to talk about. As you know, there are a multitude of injuries, lesions, and conditions that affect the white matter tracts and spinal cord, and We'd be here all the day if I tried to talk about them all. So, I want you to study clinical notes by yourself from Chapter 4 of the Snell Clinical's Neuroanatomy textbook, which I shared it with you in Navid LMS. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Happy studying.